Anil Singh from Quest there. CISO Summit 2021 has been made possible thanks to your support, along with Trend Micro, Fortinet, Sophos, and CrowdStrike. Thanks to you all. Now, threats from straight players have been in the news lately, and it's important we understand just what the scale of this is and how this is something that needs to be on our radar. We now have a case study by Michael Douglas, managing partner at InfoSec Innovations and a certified SANS instructor, discussing a case study on Chinese misadventures. Over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning in and watching this presentation where I'm going to be talking about threats from nation-state actors, and I'm going to be focusing a lot on activity from China. Now, before I begin, I do want to say thank you because, we're all experiencing Zoom fatigue probably, but I want to just say thanks for taking the time to watch this presentation, and I want to make sure that this is a valuable resource for you. And to that end, we're going to be covering a wide variety of different things that I hope will help those who are in leadership positions situate themselves such that they will be able to deal with advanced adversaries. Some things that we're going to be talking about are the notion about geopolitics intruding upon IT, and specifically information security. We're also going to be talking a bit about how security is an illusion. I want to be clear that there is no such thing as secure, that instead what we need to be doing is shifting to a tamper-evident approach. And I'll be giving you resources and things to think about as we cover this. And lastly, before we really get further along, I want you to understand that you can win, that y- you shouldn't listen to the naysayers. There's people out there who will tell you that a nation state attacker will always be better funded, better staffed, more technically competent than you. And while all of that is true, and that is a brutal reality that we do have to accept, that doesn't mean that you are bound to lose. You actually can mount cost effective defensive solutions if you so choose. But you need to understand that a lot of the things that we've done traditionally as IT, unfortunately, are little more than ritual. A lot of times the attackers have leveraged their superior knowledge of our environments against us. And so what we're going to be doing is some case studies and understand what we can learn from them so that we can better defend against these attackers. So one thing that I will also end with is that we need to demand better of the vendors. It's an unfortunate truth, but the fact that we even have to patch software, or that we as the users of software somehow are sharing the burden of improper software or like coding flaws, logic flaws, to me actually makes little sense. It's shifting the burden on those who can least afford it. Many organizations are not as well financed, funded, or staffed as the ones you represent. So small organizations globally are feeling the brunt of what is shaping up to be a global cyber war. And so if we shift the liability to the software publishers, I understand that is a radical notion, but if we shift the liability to the software publishers, things will start changing and rapidly. Now, in our limited time together, I do want to cover and touch upon all of these things. But before I dive in, I want you to understand a little bit about myself and who I am. And instead of doing a traditional, like here's my headshot and here's my bona fides, instead I want to actually talk about right now. For most of you, you're still reeling from the after effects of the Halcyon attack. For those who either somehow missed it, or maybe let's say that we're watching this far in the future and we've forgotten, the Halfium attack was an attack by a Chinese threat actor group that targeted Microsoft Exchange servers. And all attribution indicators show that this is from China. And this has been globally very disruptive and has caused much, much heartache. Now, one of my claims to fame is that I'm actually inside the Halfium breach or the Halfium notice. So if you go to the Microsoft tech blog that I have listed there, as you scroll down, they will give you various indicators. And one of the indicators here is a utility called PowerCat. I wrote PowerCat. Now, PowerCat was never intended to be used as an offensive weapon. In fact, little spoiler, there's things in PowerCat that make it very easy to detect if you know what to look for. One of my favorite detections to use for finding PowerCat is to look for port protocol mismatches. In the PowerCat documentation, we tell the people how users, whether they're good or bad, we don't that we didn't foresee. Okay, it was intended to be used for testing the strength of your own network. In this documentation, we tell you, we give you sample scripts on how to invoke PowerCat. And the thing that I am constantly surprised is that the ultra majority of times I see PowerCat used maliciously, they're almost exactly copying and pasting the usage commands and not modifying them in any ways. And one of the best detects that you can have against PowerCat, one is the presence of somebody doing this. This is technically known as a PowerShell download cradle. If you've never heard that term, that's what this is. But an even better and more crisp way to detect PowerCat in your environment is to look for a port protocol mismatch. You may want to write that down. Port protocol mismatch. If you find that you have somebody talking on a commonly used port like port 80 or port 443, and it is not being conducted, there's the traffic doesn't match web traffic, which would be the expected um, traffic over such ports, that's a port protocol mismatch. It is a very crisp and clean detect with almost zero false positives, and it works at scale that's beautifully. So please, I know this sounds weird, go find my tool in your environment. You would think that I would be some anarchist or somebody who wants to burn the world down if I made an assault tool. And I want to assure you, it is not an assault tool. It is meant to be a readily detectable tool, which is unfortunate that attackers are using this and are able to do so successfully. This tool is just a version of PowerCat. I have multiple versions that we use for penetration testing engagements. And the fact that something that is this old, that is effectively a commodity, is effective in post-exploitation, unfortunately, is a very harsh indictment on where we are as defenders. So what I want to do is apply these same thought processes that I just did in walking you through how to attack and defend against my own code. I want to share that with you on how you do this against nation states. Now, I realize some of you are saying, but Mick, you're an American. Isn't there hypocrisy? Doesn't the US of A do this sort of attacking too? And the answer is absolutely yes. If you don't believe me, just do a little bit of research. A couple of years ago, the United States it had been discovered that they were wiretapping Chancellor Angela Merkel's phone, who's the uh, lead, the head of state for Germany. And the thing that's really troubling is that Germany is an ally. So if the U.S. is monitoring an ally in this manner, it's almost certain that the US is doing this for other organizations and other entities. Which brings us to an unfortunate truth, is that everyone in the 21st century is attacking everyone. Now, these attacks, that might be too harsh of a term. Is this an attack? It's certainly not a trusting thing to do. But when we say attack, we might want to be a little more precise. And I don't know if you follow me or not on Twitter, but I was taken to account for how I was a little too imprecise with the term attack. But you do need to be mindful that your friends, your allies, and your enemies will be conducting an ongoing campaign that is often not in your best interest. And this brings me to one of our first points that I wanted to talk about. I frequently see and hear leaders at organizations complaining about how geopolitics came to IT and how now they have to defend against nation state attackers and that their job has become infinitely more difficult. I want to be very crystal clear about something. That narrative is wrong. The adversaries, the ongoing gamesmanship and brinksmanship that I've just been talking about has always been present. I've been doing this for a very long time. You can tell by the gray in my beard that I'm fast approaching gray beard status. And I've been at this for over 2 decades now. And so I have firsthand experience, and I'm here to tell you that geopolitics has always been here. Let's take a very popular and interesting moment from history. Robert Tappan Morris Jr. was or is the son of a very famous computer security researcher, and he made a worm. And on the 2nd of November, 1988, Robert Tappan Morris Jr. released his worm, and his worm went like wildfire. Now, the internet back then, of course, was obviously smaller, but his worm spread like crazy. And it was the very first worm that made international news. If you go back and search the annals of, like the BBC, for instance, you'll see many articles talking about the RTM worm. But what's interesting, and I was there, I was doing this stuff back then. I'm here to tell you, it was not the first worm. There were other worms at the time that were running across the internet. Now, there is there is a distinction though that RTM's worm had. And the reason that RTM's worm was famous is that it had multiple errors. One of the errors that it had was that it caused localized denial of service. Basically, the replication code under certain conditions would get confused and spawn off too many times. As a result, this caused network outages. And so that worm was the one that people became aware of because it caused issues. Now, why I'm talking about this will become apparent in what China is doing recently. But one of the things that you need to recall is that it wasn't the first worm. Depending on how you classify worm, there were either 5 or 7 worms that predated it. Some of the edge case worms required a little more manual intervention. The whole concept of a worm is that it's self-propagating malware. Some of the proto worms required a little extra nudge at certain points in their life cycle. So depending on how you look at it, it's you know either the 5th or 7th worm. But what's interesting and something that is lost on history and not enough people remember is that at least 2 were developed by nation states. So I'm telling you, geopolitics has always been in IT. What's happened is that over time, we hit a certain level of detente where organizations and nation states agreed to certain rules of the road. And what you're feeling when somebody says that geopolitics is entering into IT is that there's an erosion of that gentleman's agreement that took place. We now are seeing that there is this path of escalation. And in preparing for this talk, I went back and did a lot of analysis over the decades, and I've discovered that there's been a variety of incremental aggression over the last couple decades. And so, whether it's the Bluetooth worm that Russia released in a soccer stadium in Finland that within days took over about 80% of the mobile phones. And these are things that people don't remember. They was a Bluetooth worm that was released at a football stadium, 2005. And when this worm activated, it went from phone to phone. And of course, everybody's packed in the sports stadium. It was a track and field event, and all the phones within, I think it was like 30 minutes, they had a 95% infection rate of the attendees in this soccer stadium. When they left, to go back home, they're taking mass transit, everyone on those trains and buses, all the people that they interacted with that rest of the day, their phones were weaponized too. So we're having decades after decades of incremental aggression. And so I understand and even forgive somebody from thinking that all of a sudden, hey, we've been like, there's this massive problem all of a sudden. No, what's been happening is gradually things have been stepping up, getting more and more problematic, which is unfortunate. And so if you start looking through cybersecurity at the geopolitical level from a lens of incremental aggression, things all of a sudden start to make more sense. Now, I haven't got to China just yet. I'm saving that for a little bit. But if you think about things like how Russia was able to do a denial of service attack against a utilities provider in Ukraine, if that came out of nowhere, there would have been a huge international uproar. Instead, there was some, you know, upset, there was some hurt, to be sure, but there wasn't much. If you'll recall, before that, there was a massive denial of service attack against Estonia while Russia was encroaching on Estonia's borders. So, whenever you see something that takes your breath away or shocks you, I want you to immediately think, what's the context here? Now, China, what we're going to do is investigate what China's victory conditions are for cyber warfare. By better understanding what China is doing as far as their end game, as far as what they're attempting to do, you'll be better able to notice when they're making incursions in your network. You'll be able to better respond in a more targeted way against the specific element, and you'll be able to respond in a more holistic manner. All too often, unfortunately, defenders misunderstand the cues that are happening early in the attack, and they focus on a single system rather than understanding that it's a nation state backed attacker who has a very different objective than, say, an organized crime unit. Whereas an organized crime unit might be content to have a single node in a network to perpetrate fraud. Usually, nation state attackers act more as a brush fire. There's a fire here, yes, but it spreads quite rapidly. And by the time the responders arrive, they misunderstand what's going on. Maybe a better analogy would be radioactive waste. They find, yes, oh, hey, here's this container of radioactive waste. And if all you did to clean up the radioactive waste would be to remove that container, well, yeah, you've removed the source of the waste, but I'm sure anyone who's reasonable would do soil samples, water samples, etc., to make sure that it hasn't leached into the environment. And that's what we see the attackers doing. So let's investigate these victory conditions. And as I go through them, I want you to be thinking, what can we do from a strategic level to help foil them, whether it's China or some other advanced adversary that you're worried about? Now, what I'm going to be doing is an item at a time listing the different victory conditions that the attackers do. Now, again, these are specific to China. Different organizations tend to have different profiles. For instance, DPRK, North Korea, they have a very different profile than China. Their fraud tends to be more focused on financial aspects. Well, financial aspects in addition to normal cyber espionage efforts. And they do that to prop up their regime. Now, China, currently the second largest economy in the world, absolutely does not have to engage in offensive cyber incursions for monetary reasons. Instead, they're doing it for a very different set of objectives, and we're going to investigate them right now. What I'll be doing is showing them appear one at a time, and understand that as each one goes down the list, it's going to show increasing boldness. Because again, this is decades of aggression. This is not something that happened overnight. So intelligence gathering, it is the hallmark of Chinese cyber campaigns. One of the things that many organizations do not appreciate is that China is one of like they're in it for the long game is really what it is. Okay. And one of the things they don't appreciate is that this long game informs much of what they do. For instance, when you do incident response, something that my firm does, when you do incident response, there's certain time elements that we talk about. One of them is dwell time. So when the attacker gets into an environment, how long is it before we detect them? And, you know, we're getting better at it. It used to be hundreds of days to maybe even years before we would detect adversaries. Globally, the average is trending down. Now, it depends where you are in the world and especially what market vertical you're in. But in some organizations, we're getting actually okay. We're down to like 60 days, which still is an awful long time as an average dwell time. So the attackers are able to achieve this dwell time because of their intel gathering mission. What's happening is they gain access to a network and then they just stop and listen. They don't really do many attacks. In fact, China, depending on which research group you're listening to, China is the leader in a other specific type of dwell time called breakout time. Now, dwell time is the time that you get onto a network before you're caught. So that's one element. A subset of that dwell time is from the time I get onto a network to the time I move to another system inside that network. So that is traditionally referred to as breakout time. China, on average, has a longer breakout time than any other nation state actor group, which is troubling. Because as a defender, it's very easy to detect what are referred to as post-exploitation reconnaissance. Once an attacker gets in your network, they need to start interacting with systems. When it comes to intel gathering, the attacker usually has everything that they need on that one workstation. And so they will extract everything they can. They'll learn the users, what shares they connect to, what systems they interact with, what files are present. Because if they've done a good job of reconnaissance, they're not just going to be attacking any user, they're going to be attacking users who have good information. Also, be aware that the attackers will often go after users that have information and you're not fully anticipating them to have that. What I mean by that is a lot of times we have the notion that attackers will go after executives. And I want to be clear, they do. They absolutely do. But what about your project managers? What about your team leads? Those individuals have a wealth of information and make glorious targets. And I can say this with firsthand experience because one of the things my company does is we do penetration testing. And if those people are in scope and you want us to emulate a state actor, we absolutely target them because your defenders are looking after the VIPs, the senior leadership, the executives. And they forget about the lowly PMs that have project files on everything that you do. So, this intel gathering, you need to understand that China is very much and very serious about this. Much has been made about this, you know, especially with concerns about how do we do business in China, you know, how do we safely stand up a data center in China? And the answer is, well, you really can't. Their intel gathering program is that advanced. The best thing that you can do is stand up a wholly separate infrastructure and deploy it in China because the way their state security laws work is they are allowed to interact and intercept with traffic at any time and not notify you. So, from an intel gathering perspective, it pains me to say this, but I think they're the world leaders in this. But they have other victory conditions, long-term access. One of the things that not enough people realize is, I said it a little bit ago, but I need to repeat it, is that the long-term game that China is playing is very long-term. There's a couple um, cases where Chinese controlled botnets were deployed and never activated. They never did evil, and they had been deployed years in advance. So, what does that mean? Like, from a defender standpoint, if an adversary is deploying capabilities into your network and going dark for years at a time, it becomes very difficult to detect because they effectively become part of your baked in environment. And unfortunately, I have worked cases where I'm doing forensics workup and I find that there are artifacts of these, whether it's the malware itself or elements that will activate malware that become part of the gold build of organizations. I want to be very clear about this. If you do not do a good job of checking your gold builds, the images that you deploy to provision your servers and workstations, there's a very good chance that it has become weaponized at some point. You need to verify them. It sounds paranoid, but for the amount of effort it takes as an attacker to weaponize it, I absolutely would do it, especially if I've got long term goals. Now, we're going to shift here with harm to the target. One of the things that many organizations misunderstand is that they think that China is this sleeping giant that isn't ready to do malicious things, and nothing could be further from the truth. I say that with experience because one of the organizations that I worked with was received an attack from China in response to what we were doing to support the Uyghur minority. So China absolutely will interdict and act. And in many cases, so far, they have been very selective. They want to keep a fairly low profile on the international stage. But that's shifting, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, eventually, what China is going to start doing, and they're already doing this economically, is positioning themselves as the global leader. They have a goal to be the number one economy in the next 20 years. And they are going to achieve that through a variety of means. And if you don't think that cyber is part of their roadmap, I've got very bad news for you. So, as part of this global positioning, they are going to start doing some things where they jockey and attack different entities globally. And I know that they're doing this in India because I've assisted in incident response activities in India. But it gets worse. As the positioning starts to manifest, they are going to start doing a thing called asserting dominance. And that's where they say, we are now the premier cyber presence, and we'll have a greater stake in how things operate online. And then once this is achieved, they then will maintain this dominance through a variety of means. Now, you're probably looking at this list and saying, wow, this is kind of scary stuff. And to be clear, it is sobering. But I've got bad news for you. We're right about here, right now. Now, that's not to say that the intel gathering phase is done. Far from it. They continue to do all the precursors. But we are now seeing that they are attempting to assert their global dominance. And this is largely through things like the Halcyon attack that they are doing this. Up until recently, China has had a much lower, quieter profile. I don't expect that to continue. And the reason I don't expect that to continue is that they are starting to already position themselves to the maintenance phase. We'll cover that in just a little bit. And when it comes to intel gathering, China has a very strong program. They have thousands of people dedicated to doing this. They have invested in this. They have entire office buildings where people show up to work, punch a time card, work their shift, do their actions, and then punch the card to leave. And then the next shift comes in. They have taken this very seriously. And so you, as the leadership, it's incumbent on you to start looking and seeing what info would a state level actor want to get. And most organizations, really quite fascinating, most organizations immediately think, oh, we have to protect the PII data or the credit card data of our users. And to be sure, yes, thank you, please do, please do. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, they already have that information through various breaches that have happened globally. Most citizens who have some online presence already are living an open source life and they don't even know it. Many Americans have been made completely exposed online. I myself am one. My wife and I were both in the Office of Personnel Management breach, which is how the US government tracks people who work with government entities. My wife was, prior to us meeting, my wife worked in the law enforcement community. And so when we married, my data got put into that system. And even though when she left, her data was still there when this data was stolen. So it's very common that the attackers already have everything they need to know about this person. Instead, the intelligence that they're gathering is what makes your company you. Perfect example of this is if you're in the financial services industry, chances are they are not going after your staff. What they're doing instead is they're going after who your client list is, who your stock picks are, the things that really, really matter. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that you should somehow abdicate your responsibilities, whether they're contractual obligations or regulatory requirements. You do have to protect the data that you're on the hook for. You absolutely do. Just understand that you need to spend a little bit time in the mind of your adversary. What data would I want if I were China? And you'll start realizing that you have different data. And maybe after you carefully review and you say, you know what, I actually don't have data that China would be interested in, then you are especially vulnerable. And I know this sounds weird, but if you actually don't have data, you might be right. I'm not going to assume that you're right. What China will do is use you as a launching off point to other networks. Maybe it's a business partner, maybe it's a peer in some sort of consortium. But if you really don't have any data, truly don't have any data, you are uniquely a target of this sort of attack from the intel gathering. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, moments ago, I was talking about the timing aspects of how China does their attacks. The thing that not enough organizations appreciate is that this long-term access that they're doing is very much geared toward the long term. There was much concern about the implant of hardware with a particular vendor. Now, so far, those stories have been overblown. That said, it it isn't without precedent. There have been um, networking devices that have shipped with additional chips that do not belong on them. So this long-term access absolutely is part of their game plan and is something that we see. Like, let's take the Hafnium attack against the exchange servers. In every single case that I have seen, and in consulting with my peers in the industry, every single case, they have left persistence mechanisms on there, even if they didn't interact with the host. They deployed things that allowed remote access to manage that machine at a later date. So we need to break ourselves of the old habits, of the old playbooks of that I can stop the attack, I can fix that machine and redeploy it. You can't do that anymore. When an attack takes place, you now need to investigate this machine. What data was on it? How can the attackers leverage this data against me? Because they're going to come back, assuming you got them off in the first place. Now, this is something that the harm to target is something that many people almost don't believe. And more's the pity, because China has incredible technical capabilities and have been, up until recently, been very stealthy in how they've used it. They've been highly selective in the targets that they've gone after and how they use them. And if you don't believe me, do a little bit of research and look into something called the Great Cannon. The Great Cannon is a denial of service capability that China has and has used periodically starting in 2015. And they have periodically used this against organizations in a very targeted way to advance specific goals. And probably the most famous one, it was not the first time the cannon was used, but the most famous time within its first year of use was a denial of service against GitHub. And at the time, GitHub was not the ultra popular site that it was now, or that it is now. To be fair, people were using it then, but it wasn't like, if you attacked GitHub now, it would be much more noticeable and much more of a splash event. But because they're very targeted in how they use this, there's many organizations that are surprised that they even have these sorts of capabilities. Now, what makes this especially problematic is that, unlike normal, like not that's poor word choice, I'm sorry about that. Unlike non-communist nations, um, what happens with the control that China exerts over its telephone system, they can pretty much sustain the Great Cannon indefinitely, and other nations have much more limited responses. They can provision far more traffic than we defenders can absorb. Because to date, our best defenses against denial of service is to use cloud scrubbing providers. But the cloud scrubbing providers are absolutely not equipped to absorb the volume of traffic that an entire nation can bring against them. And so, what this allows us to see is that China actually is very carefully and in a very strategic method using their capabilities to position themselves as what they believe will be the dominant player in cyberspace sometime in the next, between now and the next 20 years. And so here's how they go about doing this. They've had precursors to the Great Cannon as far back actually as 2009. There were certain attacks that they were doing. But starting in 2013, China took the world by surprise by being the source of the largest distributed denial of service attack at the time. And it was by a very wide margin. And many people thought that this was some sort of a fluke accident. And the reason that they dismissed it is that they really didn't appreciate that this is just part of an ongoing escalation that China does. If they wanted to, they could have immediately jumped to the later phases of attack, but they didn't. And they probably never will. They have found that the international community is very reluctant to apply significant sanctions or do dramatic actions against an organization, against China, because it can be, problematic diplomatically. And so what they will do is they just inch, a centimeter at a time. They slowly crawl their way until they're doing things like this that shock people. But if you've been following and paying attention, you will see that there's very interesting capabilities that they've been betraying for quite some time. Now, that's not to say that they don't make moves that all of a sudden are surprising. And what I'm going to do are give you some really good resources, terms to look for in a search engine of your choice to learn about how China operates and what their actions are. Operation Night Dragon was a very interesting maneuver where it seemingly out of nowhere, they, instead of doing just typical relatively low skill but high volume denial of service attacks, Operation Night Dragon involved attacks and very coordinated attacks against power generation and distribution facilities. This is exactly the same effect that Russia had against the Ukraine's power station when they attacked part of the power grid. This Operation Night Dragon effectively is the same capability. And this should be a very sobering thought to you, because they now can potentially down systems for maximum confusion. They've also shown how willing they are to go long term and use those lateral movements from one organization to another. And nothing typifies this more than Operation Aurora. Operation Aurora did not get nearly the press that it deserved. What happened with Operation Aurora is China, through a variety of social media sites, attacked and compromised the profiles of friends and family members of people who worked at various organizations that operated in China that were non-Chinese entities. Probably the most famous target of this was Google. However, there were others that are worth mentioning, and I'll mention one specific case in just a moment. But what happened is during Operation Aurora, the Chinese cyber army attacked the friends and family members of people who worked at these non-Chinese companies, so that when these employees would go onto the social media sites their friends and family social media site would detonate on their work computer. Now, this should be terrifying for a couple reasons, but probably the most problematic is how do you defend against this? It's difficult because while I can control the access of my employees while they're at work, what can I do when they're home? How do I protect them? Do I need to protect them? How do I do that without violating their secrecy or privacy? This operation showed that China is willing to do things that we defenders are going to have a difficult time responding. I would encourage you to read and learn about Operation Aurora, and it is a very problematic issue. Now, most companies that were the target of this were Western companies, and all but a very few of them left China for a while, but are now either have come back or are slowly returning because the Chinese market is just too big to ignore. Now, there was one subset of Operation Aurora that was very concerning, and it was an attack against the RSA Corporation. Uh, you might be familiar with those key fobs with the little digits that will appear in your use as your multi-factor authentication. Well, what happened during just on the heels of Operation Aurora, it was discovered that RSA had been breached. And again, every indicator shows that it was China who did this. Now, as far as we can tell, they did not steal the ability to read the active code generators. They did not implant anything in the code generators, but what they did do is steal the source code on how those code generators work and how those code generators integrate with other authentication systems. And this is terrifying because now this means that not only do we have a well-financed, well studied adversary that we're going against, we now have an adversary that understands how some of our core login functions work. And we, as the defenders, aren't able to see this. It's asymmetric warfare because they now know more than we do. So, what they're doing is they're continuing to assert their dominance. And it's now apparent to many that they are actively engaged in this phase. The Halfium breach is very, very different, or the Halfium attacks are very, very different than the normal operation. They're very loud, they're very noisy, and the scale is huge. This is not business as it used to be, but unfortunately, I think that this will be business as normal. So, if you're looking at this Halfium attack and saying, oh my gosh, I'm concerned, you should be. And if you're looking at the Halfium attacks as a one-off, I've got very bad news for you. I think that this is just the wave of the future. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, and I'll give you some ideas on how to solve for that in just a little bit. One of the things that we're seeing, though, is that they are actively maintaining dominance. The Halfium case, for instance, they're leaving web shells and various forms of persistence on the systems. So they know that they're going to be back. These are oftentimes called long-term implants. Now, one thing that I find just amazing and a very sharp departure from normal tradecraft is that in the Halfium attack, the way that attack works, it actually leaves a door open that not just China can expose, but others can expose. And we're already starting to see ransomware authors that are able to attack using the implants that were left behind by the Chinese actor group. So there was a deliberate choice that China made. I want to be very clear, this was a deliberate choice that they made to leave implants that others could use. And I think that they're doing that so that they're causing maximum disruption for other entities so that while we're scrambling around, they can be doing their next operation. And I don't know what that is. But understand there is going to be the next operation. I don't mean to alarm you. I don't mean to sound paranoid, but it's what I would do if I were them. Now that we're scrambling around, I would use that disruption to start advancing my next attack. So how are they going to, like, what's the future? They're going to be continuing to do punitive DDoS. That's just part and parcel. What we are going to start seeing, though, is that they're going to become much more bold in using these. To date, they've been fairly careful in using these. It has been at best to target very specific anti-Chinese entities, or for more of positional capability, just letting other nation states know, hey, we have this capability too. This is going to become the norm. So, what do? Okay, but first of all, we have to admit that security is an illusion. There is no such thing as secure. And the reason I can say this, make such a bold claim such as this, is my company, InfoSec Innovations, is relatively young. We're about 4 years old. I have been doing penetration testing for about 10 years, and I've been doing computer security for about 20 years. Now, in my career as a pen tester, I have never been kept out of my networks that I'm to target. Now, I might not be able to hit my primary objective, maybe not even my secondary, but I will be able to hit a tertiary. And the reason I'm able to do this is I do reconnaissance. I have a lab in my own environment that I can replicate the network of my client. And I test my attacks over and over again for weeks, maybe even months, depending on how far out I know the engagement's going to be. And I will bypass their controls. And what's interesting is the clients are like, wow, how did you do that? How did you know what our defensive controls were? This was supposed to be a black box or a no knowledge pen test. The sad fact of the truth is, I go to job postings, I look on social media, I find what you have in your environment and replicate it in my lab. And if me, a small company in the middle of America, can do this on a very thin budget, well, frankly, I'd be disappointed if your adversaries weren't doing this for you. It would show a lack of respect. So there is no such thing as security. There really isn't. You can't be secure. I'm sorry. It's an illusion. What you can do, though, is make it be tamper evident. Because I want to be clear, prevention is worth trying. I'm not saying give up on your prevention efforts. I'm not saying that at all. You still need to do it. But what you can do is make it so that when they get into your network, you detect it. Tamper evidence is your goal. Your network is your home pitch. Now, if you look at I know this is a little weird, but I'm one of the few Americans I know that's really into cricket. And one of the things that I find very fun is if you look at, like, when it comes to tests, the team that's playing in their home stadium usually does better. They've got that home field advantage. So we have that home field advantage if we use it. So do things like collect logs. The history of information security is replete with scenarios where the logs were telling us that there was an attack underway, and people either misunderstood it or there was too much noise and they didn't appreciate the attack indicator for what it was. So review your systems, make sure they're tamper evident, conduct penetration tests, but don't think of them as a magical fix all. Instead, think of them for what they are. They're QA for your security infrastructure. So some of you, having been doing pen testing for a long time, some of you do pen tests where you try to get a good pen test report. Like, you want, hey, congratulations, we stopped the attacker. That's not what you want. That's a horrible pen test. Instead, what you want is a pen test that tells you, I did these attacks and I was detected, but then I modified these attacks and I wasn't. That's what you need. I would encourage you to look into things like purple teaming, where the attackers actually sit down with your opponent, with their opponent, the blue team, and say, "I'm about to send packets. I'm about to attack. Are you ready?" And the blue team says, "Yes, let's go." And then you start sending those packets. Did you see it? And if they did, great. But if they didn't, well, let's stop the attacks and let's tune it until we can detect it. Now, as far as pen tests go, you're going to go through fewer attack cases, but two things will happen that's beautiful. One, your defenders will skill up rapidly because they understand how attacks work and what they're doing. And two, you're fixing the problem of poorly configured network defense and host defense right then and there. So go for tamper evident. It absolutely can be done. So, I don't know if you know this, but did you know that there's a difference between pessimists and optimists? There is. The pessimist will say, "Oh no, things can't possibly get any worse." And the optimist will say, "Oh, actually, yes, it can get much worse." Joking aside, I worry that we're headed toward a horrible future because right now, the status quo I don't think is sustainable. It isn't. I don't like what's happening right now, and chances are you don't either, which is why you're at this conference, wanting to learn how to better protect your networks. So, what do we do? Well, it's hard, but I think we need to understand that we don't want to be somebody else's bot. Figure out how things are going, you know, harden your network. We're all in this together. Hold your vendors to account. At the very start of this talk, I said the radical notion that we need to have defenders not have to work so hard by publishers shipping safe code. In no other industry would software be allowed to behave like it does. Imagine if automobiles or consumer electronics behaved like computer software did. Oh, the refrigerator exploded because you closed the door incorrectly. Well, I guess that's just that refrigerator, right? We tolerate a level of errors and imprecision, and I'm not sure why. I think we need to start shifting the liability to the software publishers. And I realize that that's going to be difficult, but it's something that can be done. Make your networks tamper evident and hold buggy software developers liable. Folks, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so very much. I hope you have a pleasant day. And if you want some more detailed information about myself, here you are. So thank you once again. And good luck defending. Do reach out to me if I can be of any help. Cheers.